1862, the Wood Hat Affair. In February 1862, Burnley was a town in the grip of the Industrial Revolution. The mills ran day and night, and the population had surged. While industry brought work, it did little to improve the lives of the working class. Living conditions were harsh. The town was overcrowded and poorly planned, and the infrastructure could not cope with the growth. Most houses were built back to back with no rear access. They shared outdoor lavatories and open ash pits. Effective drainage and sanitation were virtually non-existent. Rats and flies thrived, and disease was widespread. Many homes were connected by narrow side alleys and entries, some leading to rows of privies, others simply acting as dark and dirty thoroughfares between blocks. These areas were often poorly lit, frequently dangerous, and formed a network of unseen, unregulated spaces in working-class districts. One such area was Lanebridge, a notoriously rough part of Burnley. Whip Street, located at the Manchester Road end of Finsbury Gate, was one of the town's more squalid addresses. At number 7 Whip Street lived Christiana Nuttall, a blind elderly woman. Though referred to as Mrs. Nuttall, she had never married. She was living in cramped conditions with several other occupants, including her 2 children from different fathers, Hannah and George. George Nuttall, the son, was known locally as Wood Hat, an unkind nickname, possibly referring to his perceived lack of intelligence. He was a short man with dark curly hair that framed a large bald patch on the top of his head. He had a deformity. His left hand was roughly half the size of his right. Deeply self-conscious about it, he often covered the smaller hand with the other. George was considered weak-minded by those who knew him. He was quiet and often withdrawn, but when drunk, he could become volatile. Household items, such as knives and fire irons, were sometimes hidden to prevent him from doing harm when in one of these moods. He had survived a difficult childhood and was described as accident-prone. On one occasion, he had been struck on the head with a mason's trowel, resulting in a skull fracture and suspected brain damage. He had also made multiple attempts to take his own life, at least 5 known efforts, including one near-successful attempt. Living in the same household was Hannah, his half-sister, who had separated from her husband 8 years earlier. She now lived with a man named John Duxbury. Duxbury, 37 years old, was of average height, around 5 feet 7 inches tall. He was of solid build and had a reputation for aggression, particularly when drunk. Though still legally married, his wife and 3 children lived in Blackburn. Hannah and Duxbury had cohabited for nearly 3 years. The relationship between George and Duxbury was tense. When sober, the two tolerated one another, maintaining a strained peace, but alcohol regularly brought violence. Duxbury, being the stronger and more confident of the two, usually dominated their physical confrontations, something George deeply resented, but rarely expressed outright. On Monday, the 17th of February 1862, George, Hannah, John Duxbury and another lodger went out drinking. They first visited the Friendly Inn in Lanebridge, then moved on to the Cattle Market Inn, consuming large quantities of alcohol at both establishments. They later returned to the Friendly Inn for more drinks before ending the night back at the Cattle Market Inn. By the time they began their walk home, all 4 were in an intoxicated and quarrelsome state. Along the way, Duxbury stopped at a shop to buy bloaters, salted and smoked herrings, while the others continued home to number 7 Whip Street. When Duxbury arrived at the house, the others were gathered around the fire with Christiana. George, emboldened by drink and long-held resentment, began to verbally attack Duxbury. He told him plainly that he was no longer welcome in the house. Duxbury responded in kind, questioning George's authority and hurling abuse back at him. The situation quickly escalated into a shouting match, with both men behaving in a drunken and provocative manner. Despite her blindness, Christiana could sense the danger and suggested that Duxbury leave the house to avoid further trouble. Hannah sided with Duxbury and began packing their belongings. As the pair were leaving, Duxbury remembered the bedflocks, bedding material he had forgotten. From outside, he called back through the door to ask for them. Christiana shouted that he could collect them the next day. Protegimus, the first novel in the Henry Knox saga about a former military police officer turned private investigator, is out now on Amazon. Now back to our story. Moments later, the door opened slightly. George Nuttall reached through the gap with a knife and plunged it into Duxbury's neck. Duxbury staggered away down the entry and collapsed just a few yards from the house, bleeding heavily. He died within minutes. A neighbour who had witnessed the event ran to inform George that Duxbury was dead. George, in a panic, threatened her and then tried to escape by climbing over a nearby wall. He was quickly apprehended and held until the police arrived. The inquest took place at the Canal Tavern before the coroner and a jury of 16 men. Public interest was high and the crowd gathered was so large that proceedings had to be moved to Burnley Courthouse. George appeared a pitiful figure during the inquest. He wore a worn velveteen jacket, fustian trousers and clogs. He had no shirt or necktie and sat shivering in the cold courtroom. He seemed confused throughout the testimony and appeared unable to follow what was being said. Only when the coroner declared that the verdict was one of willful murder and that he was to be committed for trial at the Lancaster Assizes did the seriousness of his position seem to reach him. He began to cry openly. At the Assizes, Mr. Justice Mellor presided. George was initially without legal representation, but the judge arranged for a barrister, Mr. Gorst of Cambridge, to speak on his behalf. Despite only being appointed the day before, Gorst delivered a well-regarded and passionate defence. He pleaded insanity. There was no dispute that George had stabbed Duxbury, but the defence argued that he was of unsound mind. Gorst referred to George's father, who had died in a lunatic asylum, as well as George's own history of severe head injuries and suicidal behaviour. He painted a picture of a man suffering from long-standing mental instability, exacerbated by poverty and alcohol. The jury deliberated for just 15 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty, but included a strong recommendation for mercy. This recommendation was passed to the Home Secretary. Within a week, George's sentence was commuted. Instead of being hanged, he was detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. This phrase meant he was held indefinitely, without a fixed sentence. Though records of his final fate are scarce, it is highly likely that George Nuttall spent the rest of his life in a secure psychiatric institution. Broadmoor, which opened in 1863, was one possible destination. There are no records of his release or death, suggesting he remained in detention until the end of his life. John Duxbury, while the victim, was also a contributor to the violence that unfolded that night. His reputation for aggression, particularly towards George, and his continued presence in a deeply unstable household added to the combustible atmosphere. It was a tragic dynamic between two troubled men, fueled by alcohol, resentment, and a lack of stability. The Wood Hat Affair is not a tale of calculated murder. It is a story of neglect, misunderstanding, and mental illness in a time when such matters were poorly understood. In modern times, George Nuttall might have been found guilty of manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility. He would likely have received psychiatric assessment and support. But in 1862, there were no such protections. His life after the trial faded into institutional silence. The case remains a stark example of how poverty, disability, and mental illness intersected in Victorian Britain, and how, in the absence of support, they could lead to devastating consequences. Thank you for watching. Please like and share this video if you'd like to see more content like this.